Picture the relentless, suffocating fog of London in the bitter, freezing night of March 1st, 1244. The River Thames is practically pitch black, reflecting nothing but the faint flickering torches of heavily armed guards patrolling the grounds of the most feared fortress on earth. High above the cobblestones, roughly 90 feet up the sheer icy face of the White Tower, a shadow clings desperately to a makeshift rope. The brutal winter wind howls through the stone battlements, masking the terrifying, agonizing sound of tearing fabric. Woven threads of bedsheets and tapestries groan under massive weight, fibers snapping one by one in the dark. Suddenly, the rope gives way completely. A massive figure plummets through the freezing air, swallowed by the darkness, followed by a sickening, bone-crushing thud that would ultimately alter the course of an entire nation's history. If you're listening to this late at night and feeling those chills down your spine, do me a favor. Smash that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me which part scared you the most. When we think of castles and fortresses from the Middle Ages, Hollywood usually feeds us this romanticized illusion of knights in shining armor, grand banquets, and fairy tale endings. But if you strip away the cinematic gloss, the reality of the 13th century was nothing short of a brutal, unforgiving nightmare. This wasn't an era of due process, Miranda writes, or a fair trial by a jury of your peers. If you crossed the wrong person, especially the king, you didn't just go to jail. You were erased from the map, and the ultimate black site, when the absolute end of the line for anyone deemed an enemy of the English crown, was the Tower of London. To put it in a modern perspective, the Tower of London wasn't just a prison, it was the world's very first Supermax. Think of it as the Alcatraz of the 1200s, but far more sinister and infinitely more isolating. Long before the feds were locking down mob bosses in ADX Florence or sending serial killers to death row in San Quentin, King Henry III was perfecting the art of psychological and physical lockdown right here on the banks of the River Thames. The centerpiece of this imposing compound was the White Tower. This wasn't a place you just broke out of. The walls of the White Tower were an astonishing 15 feet thick at the base, constructed of solid, impenetrable Kentish ragstone and local mudstone. They were designed to withstand the brutal impacts of siege engines and catapults, which meant that a single man armed with nothing but his bare hands was statistically at zero. But the architecture was only the first layer of this medieval maximum security nightmare. The White Tower was entirely surrounded by a deep, treacherous defensive moat, effectively cutting the fortress off from the rest of civilization. It was an island of despair in the middle of a bustling medieval metropolis. Furthermore, the entire perimeter was locked down by a garrison of heavily armed royal guards. These weren't your average mall cops. These were battle-hardened soldiers who patrolled the grounds day and night. They operated on a shoot-on-sight, kill-or-be-killed mentality. If you somehow managed to breach your cell, slip past the iron gates, and make it to the exterior walls, you still had to navigate a fatal drop, a moat, and an army of men whose sole purpose was to ensure you never saw the light of day again. Escaping the Tower of London wasn't just highly improbable, it was mathematically and physically impossible. It was a one-way ticket. Once those heavy iron-studded doors slammed shut behind you, you belonged to the king. And in the year 1244, the tower's most prized possession, its ultimate high-value target, was a man named Gruffydd ap Llywelyn IV. If you were looking at a medieval FBI most wanted list, Gruffydd would be sitting right at the very top, but not because he was a serial killer or a street-level thug. Gruffydd was a political prisoner of the highest order. He was a prince, the eldest son of Llywelyn the Great, the undisputed ruler of Wales. In the geopolitical underworld of 13th century Britain, the Welsh royal family operated almost like a massively powerful, fiercely independent cartel. They controlled territories, they had armies of loyal enforcers, and they constantly pushed back against the encroaching power of the English monarchy. Gruffydd wasn't just a man, he was a symbol. He carried the royal bloodline of the Welsh resistance in his veins, making him a walking, breathing threat to King Henry III's absolute dominance. But what makes Gruffydd's incarceration inside this medieval Supermax so deeply chilling is the horrific reality of how he ended up there. He wasn't captured on a battlefield by enemy soldiers in a blaze of glory. He was handed over to the feds, the English crown, by his own flesh and blood. Gruffydd was a victim of a vicious, cold-blooded family betrayal that would make modern mob syndicates look like amateur hour. He was a man who possessed immense physical strength, a commanding presence, and a fiercely volatile temper. But none of that mattered once he was betrayed and traded away like a hostage. When the heavy wooden doors of the White Tower closed on him in 1241, Gruffydd was essentially buried alive in the sky. He was designated as a special status inmate. The king couldn't simply execute him. Gruffydd was far too valuable as a pawn. As long as the English crown held him captive, they held a loaded gun to the head of the entire Welsh nation. If Wales acted out, Gruffydd would pay the price. So, King Henry III ordered him to be kept in a heavily guarded, elevated cell high up in the White Tower. Imagine the sheer psychological torture of his reality. From his narrow barred window, situated nearly 90 feet above the unforgiving stone courtyard, Gruffydd could see the ships sailing freely down the Thames. He could see the dense forests in the distance. He could smell the rain and feel the wind. The outside world, freedom, his homeland, his birthright, was right there constantly mocking him, yet utterly unreachable. For 3 agonizing years, the walls of the White Tower slowly closed in on his sanity. The isolation, the paranoia, and the creeping realization that no rescue party was coming began to eat away at his soul. He knew that the king's men were never going to let him walk out the front gates alive. He was doomed to grow old and rot away in a stone box, erased from history, while his enemies thrived. And faced with the terrifying prospect of dying a forgotten prisoner in a foreign land, a desperate, incredibly dangerous idea began to take root in Gruffydd's mind. If the feds weren't going to release him, and if his family wasn't going to save him, he was going to have to do the unthinkable. He was going to have to break out of the ultimate 13th century Supermax. But to do that, he would have to beat impossible odds, bypass an army of guards, and conquer a terrifying vertical drop that meant certain death if even one small detail went wrong. To truly understand how a hardened Welsh royal ended up rotting inside a medieval black site, you have to dig into his case file and look at the family tree. In the cutthroat world of the 13th century, blood didn't mean loyalty. Blood just meant you knew exactly who was going to stab you in the back. And for Gruffydd ap Llywelyn IV, the knife that twisted deepest was held by his own brother. If you look at the political landscape of Wales in the early 1200s, you shouldn't picture a peaceful kingdom of rolling green hills and noble knights. You need to picture a massive, heavily armed syndicate. The ruling family of Wales operated exactly like a high-level cartel, holding a monopoly on violence, land, and power. And the undisputed kingpin of this operation was Gruffydd's father, a man known to history as Llywelyn the Great. Llywelyn had spent his entire life crushing rival factions, outsmarting the English crown, and consolidating his turf. As the firstborn son, Gruffydd grew up deep inside the family business. He wasn't a silver spoon aristocrat who sat behind a desk. He was the muscle. Gruffydd was a massive, heavily built enforcer, a fierce warrior who spent his youth leading armed raids, enforcing his father's will, and demanding respect from the local warlords. In his mind, he was the heir apparent. He was the next boss. When the old man eventually passed the torch, Gruffydd fully expected to inherit the entire Welsh syndicate. But there was a fatal flaw in his profile, a technicality that would ultimately cost him everything. Gruffydd was illegitimate. He was born out of wedlock, which, in the eyes of medieval law and the powerful Catholic Church, made him a bastard. And in the ruthless hierarchy of royal succession, being a bastard meant your birthright could be stolen right out from under you. Enter Dafydd. Dafydd was Gruffydd's younger half-brother, but more importantly, he was the legitimate son born to Llywelyn's royally sanctioned wife. Dafydd was the golden boy, the polished diplomat who rubbed elbows with the English elite while Gruffydd was out getting his hands dirty in the trenches. As Llywelyn the Great grew old and his iron grip on the cartel began to slip, the inevitable power struggle kicked off. It was a classic hostile takeover, the old man desperate to keep his empire legit and recognized by the English feds, named Gruffydd as his sole heir, completely cutting Gruffydd out of the will. Gruffydd was stripped of his land, his status, and his stolen birthright. When Llywelyn finally died in 1240, the power vacuum blew wide open. Gruffydd wasn't about to just quietly walk away from the empire he helped build. He had loyal crews on the streets, men who respected his strength and despised Gruffydd's political games. A bitter, blood-soaked family feud erupted, tearing the Welsh territories apart. But Gruffydd was cunning. He knew he couldn't beat his older brother in a straight-up turf war, so he resorted to the oldest trick in the criminal underworld: the setup. Under the guise of peace talks, a sit-down was arranged. Gruffydd offered to meet with Gruffydd to negotiate a truce, to carve up the territory and settle the bad blood like businessmen. It was a trap. The moment Gruffydd let his guard down and stepped into the meeting, Gruffydd's men swarmed him. There was no negotiation, no honorable combat, or just a brutal, cold-blooded betrayal. Gruffydd threw his own flesh and blood into a dungeon, locking him away to secure his grip on the crown. But keeping a guy like Gruffydd locked up in your own backyard is incredibly dangerous. He was a high-value target with heavily armed loyalists who were constantly plotting jailbreaks and assassination attempts against Gruffydd. The younger brother quickly realized that holding Gruffydd was like holding a live hand grenade with the pin pulled. He needed a permanent solution. He needed to make Gruffydd disappear. To do that, Gruffydd made a devil's bargain with the ultimate godfather of the era, King Henry III of England. King Henry III had been watching the Welsh cartel tear itself apart with a predatory grin. He wanted absolute control over Wales, and he knew that possessing Gruffydd would give him the ultimate leverage. So, in August 1241, after King Henry flexed his military muscle and forced Gruffydd into a corner, a dirty deal was struck. Gruffydd agreed to extradite his own brother. He handed Gruffydd over to the feds. Imagine the sheer suffocating rage boiling inside Gruffydd during that prisoner transport. Bound in heavy iron chains, thrown into the back of a heavily guarded wagon, and hauled across the border into enemy territory. He hadn't been defeated by a superior army. He had been sold out by his own brother to save his own skin. Every grueling mile on the road to London was a reminder of that betrayal. When the convoy finally rolled through the muddy, fog-choked streets of London and the massive, blood-chilling silhouette of the White Tower loomed into view, the reality of his situation must have hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just a prisoner of war anymore. He was a piece of royal property. The heavy portcullis was raised, the wagon rolled into the inner ward, and the iron doors of the ultimate 13th century Supermax slammed shut behind him. King Henry III now held the most dangerous man in Wales. For the English crown, keeping Gruffydd alive and locked away meant they held a permanent gun to the head of the Welsh government. If Gruffydd ever stepped out of line or refused to pay his extortion fees to the crown, King Henry could simply threaten to release Gruffydd back into the wild to start a civil war. Gruffydd was no longer a prince, an enforcer, or a man. He was a hostage, a human bargaining chip locked down in solitary confinement and buried alive under thousands of tons of impenetrable stone, left to stew in his own hatred and plot an impossible revenge. When the heavy oak and iron-banded doors of the White Tower shut behind Gruffydd, he wasn't dragged down into a lightless, rat-infested dungeon to rot in filth. His reality was far more complex and in many ways far more psychologically devastating. Because Gruffydd was a high-value target, a royal hostage crucial to the geopolitical stability of the realm, the feds placed him in what was essentially a VIP lockup. King Henry III didn't want Gruffydd dead, nor did he want him suffering from malnutrition or disease. A dead hostage has zero leverage. So Gruffydd was marched past the lower dungeons and taken up the narrow, winding stone staircases to the upper floors of the White Tower. His new quarters were situated roughly 90 feet above the ground. He was given a relatively spacious stone chamber, a fireplace to keep the biting London dampness at bay, decent food, and even a modest allowance to maintain his royal dignity. By medieval prison standards, it was a penthouse suite. But make no mistake, it was a gilded cage, and the psychological torture of a VIP solitary confinement is a unique kind of hell. Imagine being a man who spent his entire life in the wild, rugged mountains of Wales, a man whose identity was forged on battlefields and in the open air, suddenly reduced to pacing the same cold stone floor, measuring his existence by the shifting shadows on the wall. For roughly 3 years, the rhythmic, heavy footsteps of the royal guards pacing the corridor outside his door became the soundtrack of his life. He was locked down for 24 hours a day, an eagle trapped in a shoebox. The most agonizing aspect of his confinement was the window. Unlike the miserable souls in the subterranean pits who lived in pitch blackness, Gruffydd's elevated cell had a narrow, barred slit of a window. Through that thick stone embrasure, he had a panoramic view of the world he was forbidden to touch. He could look out over the sprawling, filthy, vibrant city of London. He could watch the Thames River snaking through the landscape, carrying merchant ships and barges back and forth. He could see the horizon, the sky, the changing of the seasons. He could literally see freedom every single day, dangling just out of reach, separated from him by an impossible 90-foot drop and a heavily armed garrison. To break a man, you don't necessarily have to beat him. You just have to give him hope and then slowly, methodically crush it. That was King Henry's game. For the first year or two, Gruffydd clung to the belief that the system would work, that diplomacy would somehow spring him. He wasn't entirely cut off from the outside world. In a rare display of leniency, the king allowed his wife, Senina, to visit him. Senina was relentless. She was his advocate on the outside, a desperate woman navigating the treacherous, snake-filled waters of the English royal court. Trying to cut a deal to buy her husband's life, she spent long nights negotiating, bribing officials, and desperately trying to scrape together an extortionate ransom. In 1241, she even signed a brutal treaty with King Henry III, agreeing to hand over massive sums of money, Welsh hostages, and huge tracts of land, all in exchange for Gruffydd's release. She handed the king a blank check, hoping it would buy the key to the White Tower. But the king played her. He took the money, he took the hostages, and then he simply moved the goalposts. Henry III looked at the signed treaty, smiled, and completely reneged on the deal. He had no intention of ever letting Gruffydd out. The hostage was too valuable right where he was, a permanent, breathing threat locked inside a stone vault, keeping the Welsh government terrified and compliant. When the news of the king's betrayal finally reached Gruffydd in his high-altitude cell, something inside him snapped. The illusion of a diplomatic resolution evaporated. He realized with absolute horrifying clarity that the system was rigged. The law didn't apply to him. It was just a weapon used by the crown to keep him chained. Senina's visits became a painful reminder of his impotence. Meet Sarai. He was watching his wife exhaust herself, watching his loyalists bleed out their fortunes to a corrupt king who was stringing them along for sport. As the realization sank in, the depression that often plagues long-term inmates began to warp into a cold, hardened resolve. Gruffydd knew that if he stayed in that room, he was going to die there. He would become a forgotten footnote in history, an old man wasting away, losing his mind to the endless ticking of the clock, while his treacherous brother David ruled his homeland. There was no parole board. There was no habeas corpus. There was no rescue squad coming to breach the walls. If Gruffydd wanted to breathe free air again, he was going to have to do it himself. He had to cross the line from a passive, waiting hostage to an active, highly motivated escape artist. Wait, but breaking out of the White Tower required more than just courage. It required absolute madness. He was locked behind impenetrable walls, heavily guarded and hovering 90 feet in the air. He had no tools, no inside men among the guards, and no blueprints. Yet, as the bitter winter of early 1244 set in, Gruffydd stopped pacing the floor in despair and started looking at his cell, not as a tomb, but as an armory. He began to calculate, to observe the guards' routines, to measure the distance to the ground from his narrow window. The most daring, desperate, and fatally flawed prison break in medieval history was officially in motion. The VIP hostage was preparing to go ghost. When you're locked down in the ultimate 13th century Supermax with no tools, no inside help, and zero margin for error, survival demands absolute ingenuity. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn IV had to become the medieval equivalent of MacGyver. He couldn't dig a tunnel like El Chapo because he was suspended 90 feet in the air. He couldn't saw through the bars with a smuggled hacksaw blade because metallurgy and contraband smuggling simply weren't options in the White Tower's VIP tier. His only exit strategy was vertical, and the only way down was to build his own ladder out of thin air. To understand the sheer audacity of this blueprint, you have to look at the environment Gruffydd was operating in. The window of his cell was narrow, just wide enough for a large man to squeeze his shoulders through if he forced it. But the real nightmare was the drop, 90 feet. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to hanging out of an 8- or 9-story building. Look down from an 8th-floor balcony sometime and imagine trying to climb down the sheer flat face of the building using nothing but a makeshift rope. Now imagine doing it in the pitch black, with a freezing wind tearing at your clothes, knowing that if you slip, there is no safety net, no padded landing, just solid, bone-shattering cobblestone. Gruffydd needed a rope, and he needed a long one. Because of his status as a royal hostage, he had access to a few luxuries that the miserable inmates in the lower dungeons didn't. He had bedding. He had heavy tapestries covering the cold stone walls to keep the drafts out. Down he had tablecloths and extra layers of woolen clothing provided by his desperate wife, Sanina, during her visits. To the casual observer, these were just the mundane comforts of a VIP lockup. But to a man planning to break out, this was a goldmine of raw materials. In total secrecy, Gruffydd began a massive, painstakingly slow manufacturing operation right under the noses of the feds. Every night, when the guards completed their rounds and the heavy silence of the tower settled in, he went to work. He started stripping his bedsheets, tearing the linen into long, manageable strips. He pulled down the heavy tapestries and carefully dismantled them, unraveling the strong woven threads. He sacrificed his own clothing, ripping thick woolen tunics into rugged cords. He had to be incredibly stealthy. Sacked if the guards walked in and saw half his bedding missing, or the tapestry shredded, the game was over. He would be thrown in irons and dragged to a lightless hole where escape was truly impossible. So, he had to hide his work. He likely stuffed the growing lengths of his makeshift rope under his mattress, inside his remaining clothes, or in the dark, dusty corners of his spacious cell. Night after night, he braided and knotted the strips together. He wasn't just tying simple knots. He was aggressively weaving the fabrics, trying to create a tensile strength capable of holding human weight. He combined the softer linens with the heavy, coarse wool of the tapestries, hoping the friction of the knots would hold the whole terrifying contraption together. Slowly, foot by agonizing foot, the rope grew. 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet. It was a massive, bulky, unwieldy python of torn fabric, smelling of sweat, dust, and desperation. But as Gruffydd worked in the dim light of his fireplace, a fatal flaw was silently being woven into his master plan, a grim, unforgiving reality of physics that he was either ignoring or hopelessly underestimating. Historical records are very clear about one specific detail regarding Gruffydd ap Llywelyn IV. He was a massive man. The chronicles describe him as heavily built, exceptionally stout, and carrying a significant amount of weight. He wasn't a wiry, lightweight acrobat who could nimbly slide down a silken thread. He was a bruising, heavy-set enforcer who had spent years eating a high-calorie aristocratic diet while sitting completely sedentary in a locked room. This was the terrifying variable in his equation. Defap how a makeshift rope constructed from medieval linen, wool, and ripped tapestries might hold a small man or a child, but Gruffydd was asking those torn threads to support potentially over 250 pounds of dead weight, entirely suspended in midair. Every single knot he tied was a gamble. Every braided strip of bedsheet was a potential breaking point. He was essentially playing Russian roulette with physics. Did he know it was a suicide mission? Did he understand that the sheer mass of his body was pushing the structural integrity of a torn blanket way past its breaking point? Maybe, but you have to factor in the desperation of a man who has been locked down for 3 years, a man who knows he is scheduled to die in that room. When you're facing a lifetime of solitary confinement, on the horrific risk of a 90-foot drop suddenly looks like a reasonable gamble. By late February of 1244, the rope was finished. It was a monstrous, terrifying lifeline, stretching out nearly 100 feet when uncoiled. The trap was set. Gruffydd had his exit vector. He just needed the right conditions. He needed a night so miserable, so dark, and so chaotic that the guards patrolling the moat below would be blind and deaf to what was happening above them. He didn't have to wait long. The brutal English winter was about to provide the perfect cover for the most dangerous stunt of his life. The countdown to March 1st had begun. The night of March 1st, 1244, didn't just fall over London. It slammed into the city like a physical assault. It was the kind of night that seasoned guards despised. The temperature plummeted below freezing, and a dense, suffocating fog rolled off the River Thames, wrapping the White Tower in an impenetrable gray shroud. The wind wasn't just blowing, it was howling, violently whipping around the ancient stone battlements like a chorus of screaming ghosts. This was exactly the kind of chaotic, miserable weather a desperate man prays for. Inside his elevated cell, Gruffydd ap Llywelyn IV was out of time. The psychological weight of 3 years in solitary confinement, the betrayal by his family, the mockery of a rigged system. It all culminated in this single, terrifying moment. He pulled his massive, bulky rope from its hiding place. It was a chaotic, ugly lifeline, a thick braided snake of ripped bedsheets, heavy wool tapestries, and shredded clothing. His massive chest heaving with adrenaline, he approached the narrow slit of the window. Roughly 90 feet below him, the courtyard was a black abyss. The torches of the guards were reduced to faint, blurry smudges in the thick fog. Even if they looked up, the darkness and the weather provided a perfect optical shield. But the wind was a double-edged sword. It masked any noise he might make, but it also threatened to tear him right off the face of the tower. Gruffydd secured one end of his massive makeshift rope to the thick stone mullion of his window, tying the knots with a frantic, desperate strength. He tugged at it, testing the anchor. It held fast. He fed the rest of the monstrous coil out through the narrow gap. The wind immediately caught the heavy fabric, whipping it violently into the freezing night air, until it unspooled and hung down the sheer face of the White Tower, disappearing into the blackness below. This was the point of no return. There was no turning back, no second guessing. Gruffydd squeezed his large, heavy-set frame through the brutally tight stone embrasure. The stone scraped against his chest and back, the freezing wind instantly biting through his layers of clothing. He pushed himself out, shifting his weight from the solid stone sill to the unstable, swaying mass of knotted fabric. For a split second, he hung suspended in the embrasure, looking down into the absolute void. Then he committed. He gripped the braided bedsheets and lowered his full, a massive weight out into the empty air. The moment the rope took his weight, it groaned. The makeshift fibers stretched violently, pulled taut under the immense burden of a man who weighed upwards of 250 pounds. Gruffydd began his descent. Hand over hand, his knuckles turning white, he lowered himself down the freezing, abrasive stone face of the tower. It was agonizingly slow. He wasn't a trained climber. He was a desperate prince fighting for his life. Every time he slid his hands down to the next knot, the rope violently jerked, sending a terrifying jolt through his arms and shoulders. His muscles burned with lactic acid, screaming under the strain of supporting his massive bulk. He was suspended in total darkness, a heavy pendulum swinging wildly in the gale-force winds. The cold was numbing his fingers, making it incredibly difficult to maintain his grip. He had to squeeze the rope with a death grip, his forearms cramping as he descended foot by foot, 10 feet down, 20 feet, 30 feet. The physical exertion was unimaginable. He was panting heavily, his breath pluming in the freezing air, swept away instantly by the wind. Below him, he could faintly hear the distant muffled sound of a guard's heavy boots hitting the cobblestones, the clanking of chainmail barely audible over the roaring gale. The adrenaline was redlining, his heart hammering against his ribs like a sledgehammer. He was actually doing it. The impossible escape was happening. He was bypassing the ultimate Supermax. But as he descended past the halfway point, roughly 50 feet above the deadly, unyielding stone courtyard, the terrifying reality of physics began to catch up with him. The rope wasn't just a static line. It was a living, breathing thing under extreme duress. The combination of Gruffydd's immense weight, the violent jerking motion of his descent, and the relentless freezing wind battering him against the wall was creating an astronomical amount of tension on the knotted fabric. Every time he dropped his weight to a new section of the rope, he heard a sound that would freeze the blood in any man's veins. Crack. It wasn't a loud noise, but a sharp, distinct popping sound echoing through the fibers in his hands. It was the sound of individual threads snapping. The linen and wool simply weren't designed to hold this kind of dynamic load. Gruffydd froze, suspended 50 feet in the air, his boots desperately seeking purchase against the flat, icy stone wall. He clung to the rope, his massive body swaying sickeningly in the wind, listening. Pop, tear. The sound was getting louder, vibrating right through the fabric into his bleeding palms. The structural integrity of his makeshift lifeline was actively disintegrating. The knots he had so carefully tied were beginning to slip, the friction failing under the brutal law of gravity. He looked down into the black abyss. The ground was still 50 feet away, a survivable drop only in Hollywood movies. In reality, hitting the stone courtyard from that height was an absolute death sentence. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded his system. He tried to move faster, trying to outrun the failing rope, sliding his hands down desperately, hoping to clear the distance before the inevitable happened. But gravity has no mercy, and physics does not negotiate with desperate men. Suspended roughly 50 feet in the air, swallowed by the freezing blackness of the London fog, Gruffydd ap Llywelyn IV was trapped in a terrifying, slow-motion nightmare. He was literally clinging to a disintegrating thread. The wind howled, violently whipping his heavy body back and forth against the icy stone of the White Tower. But louder than the gale, louder than his own ragged, terrified breathing, was the horrific, sickening sound of tearing fabric directly above his hands. He tried to scramble downward, but his massive bulk worked against him. Every desperate jerk, every shift of his weight exponentially increased the stress on the weakened fibers above him. The makeshift rope, a Frankenstein creation of ripped bedsheets and shredded tapestries, was screaming under the impossible load. Then it happened. The fatal flaw finally gave way. It wasn't a clean, instantaneous break like a severed cable. It was an agonizing, drawn-out, catastrophic failure. The sharp pop of individual threads snapping rapidly escalated into a horrific, tearing sound, the sound of dense fabric violently ripping itself apart. The fibers at a critical stress point, somewhere between his bleeding hands and the high window above, simply dissolved under the massive tension. The rope snapped. In a fraction of a second, the horrific tension vanished, replaced by the weightless, stomach-dropping horror of freefall. Gruffydd was violently snatched from the wall by gravity. The sickening realization that he was falling must have hit him instantly, But there was no time to scream, no time to brace for impact. He was plunging through 50 feet of pitch-black, freezing air, in clutching a useless, severed piece of knotted bedsheet in his massive hands. When you fall from that height, physics dictates a brutal, unforgiving reality. Due to Gruffydd's heavy, stout physique, his center of gravity was severely compromised as he plummeted. He didn't fall feet first in a controlled drop. As the wind roared past him and the black cobblestones rushed up to meet him, his heavy body inverted in midair. He rotated violently, flipping upside down in the darkness. The impact was catastrophic. He didn't hit the ground hit him. He slammed headfirst into the unforgiving solid stone pavement at the base of the White Tower with the force of a high-speed car crash. The sheer kinetic energy of a man weighing over 250 pounds hitting solid rock from a 50-foot drop is devastating. Historical chronicles of the event don't hold back on the grisly forensic details. The impact was entirely focused on the top of his skull and his neck. The blunt force trauma was so extreme, so unbelievably violent, that his neck completely snapped and the bones of his cervical spine shattered upon impact. The brutal force of his massive, heavy body coming down behind his head drove his neck downward with such catastrophic momentum that, according to the grim historical records, his head was violently forced almost entirely down into his chest cavity. It was an instant, unimaginably violent death. His skull fractured, his spine pulverized, his massive body crumpling into a broken, lifeless heap on the freezing wet stones. There was no struggle. No agonizing final breaths. The heavy, brutal thump of his body impacting the courtyard was swallowed instantly by the roaring wind and the thick London fog. The guards patrolling the perimeter, huddled in their cloaks against the bitter cold, heard absolutely nothing. The massive stone walls of the fortress absorbed the sound, keeping the horrific secret locked in the dark. For hours, as the brutal storm raged on and the night dragged toward dawn, the broken, twisted body of the Welsh prince lay completely alone in a pool of freezing blood. Above him, 50 feet in the air, the jagged, torn end of his makeshift rope whipped violently in the wind. A ghostly, pathetic flag marking the exact spot where a desperate man's gamble had failed in the most horrific way imaginable. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn IV had technically beaten the impossible odds. He had slipped past the guards. I bypassed the locked doors and made it outside the walls of his VIP cell. But he hadn't escaped the Tower of London. The ultimate Supermax had simply changed the method of execution. It had let him climb out the window, only to let gravity serve as the executioner. He died exactly as he had lived his final 3 years, in total, utter isolation, betrayed by the very physics he thought he could outsmart, a silent, bloody warning to anyone else who dared to challenge the impossible lockdown of the king's fortress. When the miserable freezing dawn finally broke over London on March 2nd, 1244, the thick fog began to lift, revealing a crime scene that would send shockwaves through the entire kingdom. As the royal guards began their morning patrols around the base of the White Tower, the dim morning light illuminated a horrific sight on the icy cobblestones. There, crumpled in a grotesque, unnatural pile, lay the massive, lifeless body of Gruffydd ap Llywelyn IV. To the guards who found him, the scene must have looked like something out of a nightmare. Gruffydd's body was mangled almost beyond recognition. His neck shattered so violently that his head appeared gruesomely compressed into his shoulders. When they looked up, the entire terrifying story wrote itself. High above them, snapping violently in the bitter morning wind, hung the frayed, torn end of the makeshift rope trailing down from the narrow embrasure of his high-altitude cell. The alarm was immediately raised, and the news hit the English royal court like a bomb. King Henry III was absolutely furious. The ultimate impenetrable Supermax had been breached, not from the outside, but from within. A high-value hostage, a man whose continued existence was the linchpin of the king's entire strategy to control Wales, had managed to slip out of a locked, heavily guarded room. The king didn't just order the body cleared away, he fundamentally changed the security protocols of the Tower of London forever. He demanded a massive, paranoid overhaul of the fortress. In direct response to Gruffydd's fatal plunge, Henry ordered that the windows of the upper chambers in the White Tower be permanently narrowed and fortified, thus ensuring that no man, no matter how desperate, could ever squeeze through them again. Gruffydd's terrifying gamble had forced the feds to upgrade their black site, but the true aftermath of this horrific prison break wasn't contained within the stone walls of London. The ripples spread outward, carrying blood and fire all the way back to Wales. When the news of Gruffydd's gruesome death reached his homeland, the reaction wasn't sorrow. It was an explosive, uncontrollable rage. For years, the Welsh factions had been divided, locked in a bitter internal struggle orchestrated by Gruffydd's treacherous deal with the English crown. But Gruffydd's death, a royal prince dying like an animal on the cold stones of a foreign prison, became an instant, violently powerful rallying cry. It was the spark that ignited a powder keg. The man who truly weaponized this tragedy was Gruffydd's own son, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd. Llywelyn didn't just mourn his father. He used the horrific imagery of that fatal fall to unite the fractured Welsh cartel. He pointed a finger directly at the English crown and the treacherous uncle who had handed his father over to the feds. Llywelyn framed his father not as a failed escape artist, but as a martyr who chose a terrifying plunge into the dark over living on his knees in an English cage. Driven by vengeance and fueled by the outrage of a nation, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd launched a massive, brutal campaign to take back his family's stolen legacy. He ruthlessly crushed his rivals, completely dismantled his Uncle Gruffydd's hold on power, and relentlessly attacked the English forces. He was wildly successful. He didn't just win back his father's territory, he unified all of Wales, eventually forcing the English crown to officially recognize him as the Prince of Wales. The first and only time an English king formally acknowledged that title for a native Welsh ruler. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn Fawr had gambled everything on a desperate, physically impossible climb down a wall of ice and stone. He lost the gamble in the most brutal, agonizing way imaginable. Dying alone in the dark, with his spine shattered on the cobblestones. He never got to taste the freedom he so desperately craved. But in a twisted, bloody irony, his catastrophic failure achieved exactly what his survival could not. The horrific image of a Welsh prince plunging to his death from the king's impenetrable fortress ignited a firestorm of rebellion that completely reshaped the geopolitical map of 13th century Britain. His broken body on the stones of the Tower of London became the foundation upon which his son built an independent, fiercely defiant Welsh nation. It's a chilling reminder of the true cost of freedom, and how sometimes the most catastrophic failures can echo through history far louder than any victory. If you made it this far into the dark, cold night with me, I appreciate you. If this horrific dive into the darkest corners of history gave you chills, do me a massive favor. Smash that subscribe button, hit the like, and drop a comment below telling me if you think Gruffydd knew it was a suicide mission when he climbed out that window. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.